So you're going first or second?
I'm going to go first.
Okay. No, that's right. Hello. I'm Kirsten Ringelberg from the Elon that's not Elon University. The title of this panel is On Our Gaydar, Modernisms in Britain, Canada, and the United States. So our first speaker in this panel will be Johnny Willis. I don't know if you know who Johnny Willis is. I'm just excited to have a moment where we can all just watch you do your thing that isn't helping us. So, thank you very much. Johnny Willis is a non-binary art historian, go team! Who began working on the first Homosexuals as a curatorial assistant and was subsequently elevated to associate curator, as well as associate editor of the accompanying 22-essay anthology, Breathe. An honors graduate of the University of Pennsylvania who earned their MA at the University of British Columbia, Willis is now serving as curatorial fellow at Wrightwood 659 and has a very bright future in the field if this is the early work. Come on. We all owe them a debt of gratitude for their labor on this symposium as well as the exhibition, all done with warmth and patience and joy and beauty and fabulous outfits. Please join me in a hearty round of applause as we welcome Johnny to the podium.
I'm done crying for the day. Started with Ty and continued with the Pavels and now Kirsten. So please, no more tears. I beg of you. So, thank you all for a day full of insightful and stimulating presentations. I'm honored to be one of the last. Like many of us, I'm interested in the peripheral, the marginal, and the silenced. I'm also interested in what would happen to the canon if we centered the periphery, realigned the margins, and tuned in to the silence. This is both a presentation on Canadian art and on lesbian historical methodologies, two rather marginal subjects. In the words of Terry Castle, quote, "When it comes to lesbians, many people have trouble seeing what's in front of them," end quote. Castle's conception of the apparitional or ghostly lesbian subject in dominant histories testifies to the ways in which lesbians are persistently denied or erased, though remain hauntingly present. This talk investigates the so-called spectral lesbian and her epistemological status, asking what can be made of her silence and our silence towards her. In 1911, the aspiring American-born Canadian sculptors and lifelong partners Francis Loring and Florence Weil approached Daniel Chester French, now famed for his 1920 statue of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial, to apply for employment in his Greenwich Village studio. They had both trained in neoclassical sculpture with Lorado Taft, among others, at the Art Institute of Chicago, a little-known fact, and thus expected a warm welcome into French's atelier. The pair instead encountered a mystifyingly brusque rejection from the prominent sculptor, and later discovered that Taft had written to French not only to denounce their abilities as artists, but to warn him of their lesbianism. Taft, Taft, who was well known for his 1903 publication, The History of American Sculpture, demanded that his students at the Art Institute address him as the master, and was known to sexually harass his younger female pupils. His letter was likely an act of retaliation for Weil's blatant distaste for his predatory behavior and her refusal to entertain his advances. By 1911, the notion that lesbianism was a congenital yet contagious illness had been widely circulated, even if male homosexuality was more often subject to criminal prosecution and loomed a little larger in anxieties of social degeneration at this moment. Both the English sexologists have, like Ellis's sexual inversion, and to a lesser extent, the German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis worked to pathologize female homosexuality as a dangerous perversion of natural will in the medical legal sphere and the popular imagination in Canada, Britain, and the United States. In Ellis's chapter, Sexual Inversion in Women, he underscores how prominent murder and suicide are among lesbians in America, although he was himself married to a lesbian woman, as many of you may know, Edith Lees Ellis, otherwise known as Miss H, or Case Study 42 in the text. Literally, his wife is a lesbian case study in his famous book. Yes, I know.
And not even number one.
No, number 42. Okay, where was I? While Ellis employs the word lesbian occasionally throughout his text, he prefers the cacophonous epithet congenital sexual invert. Yeah. Inversion here denotes that a subject embodies a male soul in a female form, or vice versa, positing gender nonconformity as the defining characteristic of sexual deviance. Thus, according to predominant late 19th century sexology, lesbians were but perverse men stuck in women's bodies. Following Taft's homophobic defamation of the girls, their perennial sobriquet, Loring and Weil were made forcibly aware that to name was to pathologize. As the lesbian literary historian Harriet Andreadis has pointed out, quote, the effect of naming, and the more public the naming, the more profound the effect, was to bring to the consciousness of individuals the connections between their behaviors and their named transgressions. In this way, to name may be to inhibit and constrain, end quote. It is thus unsurprising that Loring and Weil left behind no written evidence of the nature of their relationship. As one of their biographers has written, quote, there is no way of knowing whether Loring and Weil had a sexual relationship. In the absence of letters or any other evidence from the girls, there is only silence, end quote. The error that this biographer and nearly every writer on Loring and Weil has made, besides reifying heteronormative historiography, as Kirsten mentioned earlier, is to have fallen victim to the ostensible dead end of silence, when it is often itself a generative site of inquiry. On lesbian history, Martha Vicinis puts it best, quote, silence is not empty, nor is absence invisible, end quote. And yes, I like how this ties into the previous panel. The writers of early Canadian art histories have also advanced a genital-centric logic of lesbian identification, which is to say, they demand explicit evidence of sexual activity between two women in order to qualify them as lovers or lesbians, a standard that's not exactly equally applied for heterosexual couples. This logic neglects the reality of lesbian existence. As the Canadian historian Cameron Duder explains, quote, lesbian relationships existed in a context of silence and fear and were balanced against the need for familial connection, financial security, maintenance of respectability, and physical safety. Their relationships were hidden from many, but were there to be seen by those who knew when and how to see and hear, end quote. Not naming was to expressly evade the pathological baggage of a name, and hence of an identity category. I want to argue here that an erotics of unnaming, to use Andreadis' term, was a discursive strategy successfully employed by Canadian lesbian artists around the turn of the century. Artists had access to a privileged medium of expression, one that could eschew linguistic and thus punitive and disciplinary dogma. That their identities were unspoken, however, does not mean that they did not lead complex and rich psychic lives, and they certainly expressed their identifications through their artistic practices. Put otherwise, their works of art, often accomplishing what language could not, enabled their makers to speak the unspeakable. The modern identities, Canadian and lesbian, came into being at a similar time near the end of the 19th century and grew up together through the 20th. The Impressionist painter Florence Carlyle was in fact born before the concepts of homosexuality and a monolithic Canadian state existed. And Loring and Weil actively contributed to the cultivation of a distinctly Canadian identity through their work and public commissions following their resettlement in Toronto in 1912. It should be noted that, however, that these artists did not necessarily call themselves lesbian. They were nonetheless in long-term devoted partnerships with women and foregrounded distinctly sapphic imagery in their art. The identity categories of Canadian and lesbian were still in flux around the turn of the century and arguably would not crystallize until mid-century. Just to note that my focus on lesbian artists is not necessarily a feminist choice of my own. The queer artists we know of working in Canada at this time simply happy to be lesbian. This may be because there's very little extant research on queer art history in Canada before World War II, or perhaps because lesbian relationships were not criminalized to the same degree as male homosexual relations were, and the model of romantic friendship that has been brought up was a model that they could use to sort of cohabitate and effectively live as a married couple without legal recognition. In the Canadian context, the Impressionist painter Florence Carlyle is the first homosexual artist on record. She's become a favorite of the First Homosexuals team and our visitors, and yet she remains little known and understudied. What we do know is that Carlyle rarely painted men, and that her work is deeply invested in the erotic and emotional lives of women, especially that of her lover, Judith Hastings. She was born in Canada West, now southern Ontario, in 1864 to a bourgeois family of British descent. Her great-uncle was the famed Scottish historian and essayist Thomas Carlyle, the Sage of Chelsea, a relation that she utilized to help legitimize her career. In 1890, she departed her family home in Woodstock, Ontario, to study in Belle Epoque, Paris for 5 years at the Académie Julian, which of course has been mentioned as well by many speakers. And she painted the white flower shown here at the Académie Julian. The canvas portrays a rosy-cheeked nymph standing upright, wearing a sheer dress that reveals full breasts. Nymphs, like satyrs, were associated with libertine sexuality and licentiousness in Greek mythology. The term nymphomania was in fact coined in the 19th century to describe women whose sexualities were ostensibly excessive. But this painting instead seems to celebrate the nymph's feminine seductiveness. In art history, nymphs are nearly always depicted as seducing men, such as in Waterhouse's celebrated picture. But tellingly, Carlyle depicts a soul nymph, leaving the subject of the nymph's seduction up for question. This removal of the archetypal male subject opens the paintings to possibilities of same-sex desire. The spindle-shaped figure also takes on the form of a chrysalis or cocoon, reflecting period notions of queerness as a transformative process of becoming. The founding figure of aestheticism, Walter Pater, described this privileging of becoming over mere being as, quote, the perpetual weaving and unweaving of ourselves, end quote. The cocoon and its shedding symbolize this everlasting process of becoming, foreshadowing the mature, queer creature that subsequently emerges from its sheath. In Carlyle's later painting, The Moth, the figure emerges from her casing, recalling Emily Dickinson's lines, quote, from cocoon forth a butterfly, as lady from her door emerged a summer afternoon, end quote. Indeed, the subject's body and dress take on a distinctly arthropod shape. The moth is drawn to a flame, as Shakespeare famously wrote in The Merchant of Venice, thus hath the candle singed the moth. The relationship of a moth to a flame has long been understood as an allusion to temptation. So in both The White Flower and The Moth, Carlyle depicts metaphors of desire and temptation manifested in sapphic rhetoric. In 1911, at the age of 46, Carlyle traveled to Wimbledon and met Judith Hastings, a woman she described as pink as a rose, and the two women became immediately infatuated with one another. They would remain together for the rest of Carlyle's life. Hastings quickly became the artist's preferred model and muse. The nature and significance of the relationship, however, has been bowdlerized by the art historical authority on the artist, Susan Butlin. Butlin rejects the possibility that the two might have even been lovers, despite a visual and epistolary evidence. Feminist art history has at times failed to acknowledge the possibility of women's love for other women. In The Threshold, for instance, a chef-d'oeuvre of Canadian Impressionism, Carlyle depicts Hastings in the traditional garb of a bride during a moment of quiet introspection, clutching her hands to her chest with her eyes solemnly shut. In a marital context, the threshold refers to the act of the groom carrying his bride over the threshold of a doorway to their new home, symbolizing the dawn of a new stage in life. In retrospect, the canvas would come to signify the very threshold of Carlyle and Hastings' life together. You'll see that this painting on the left, on your left here, was included in our 2022 exhibition, and this painting here on the right is in our 2025 version. Following a honeymoon in Italy, the couple decided to permanently settle down in a cottage in Sussex, England, which they lovingly called Sweet Hawes. There, Carlyle painted High Noon, a portrait of Hastings resting after sleeping in their home. The magisterial interior scene melds together impressionist brushwork and a scientific study of light, reminiscent of Dutch Golden Age painting. In letters from their time at Sweet Hawes, Hastings would often refer to the painter as Carl, or a playful masculinization of her surname. The couple nonetheless adhere to discretion more broadly, observing the expected proprieties and tacit codes of society to balance the need to maintain their careers, familial relations, and social status. As one journalist commented in 1913, quote, of Florence Carlyle herself, little has been written. The reason is, she has not permitted it, end quote. This shielding of biographical investigation was a common technique lesbian artists employed to maintain a private life at a time when coming out of the closet wasn't necessarily liberatory. As Martha Vicinis reminds us, quote, "We have too long assumed that women in the past could not name their erotic desires, rather than recognizing their refusal to name those desires." Frances Loring and Florence Weil similarly shielded themselves from biographical investigation and further ensured that no letters were left behind. The utility of art historical investigation is particularly evident in these silenced contexts. Take Sun Worshipper of 1916, for example, a work also in the exhibition. Weil's bronze of a kneeling nude woman in a sort of sprawling, dramatic contrapposto. The figure arches her back to raise her chest to the sun and horizontally lifts her arm in the opposing direction, capturing a moment of ecstasy. The sculpture's eroticism is palpable in the expression and posture of the figure, an effect heightened by the work's lustrous surface. Weil was devoted to a classical ideal of the body. Quote, she once said, "The Greeks settled my ideas, gave them to me in the beginning. Greek sculpture, I think it's the best we've ever had," end quote. She relentlessly produced sculptures in wood, marble, and bronze of nude female torsos throughout her career, striving to achieve a classical perfection of form. Weil's sapphic classicism would have been recognizable to someone like Havelock Ellis, as he wrote in Sexual Inversion, quote, "The inverted woman is an enthusiastic admirer of feminine beauty, especially of the statuesque beauty of the body," end quote. As I mentioned before, Loring and Weil met at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1906, and they remained lovers for an impressive 6 decades until their respective deaths in 1968. Weil was 6 years Loring's senior and had already begun teaching sculpture, while Loring came from a wealthier family and had already studied in Paris, Geneva, and Munich. The reciprocal portrait bust from 1911, produced during their brief stay in Greenwich Village, simultaneously immortalize their coupledom and mark a budding moment in their lifelong dedication to one another. The works not only convey the respective sitters' likeness, but each artist works with the sculptural base utilized in the opposite artist's practice. Loring's bust of Weil depicts her as dignified yet unassuming, emerging from a plinth, Weil's method of choice. Weil sculpts Loring contiguous with her plaster base, integrated in a singular whole, as Loring preferred to work. This subtle disparity in sculptural base and the mutual recognition of each other's stylistic tendencies speaks to the individualism of each artist and to their assertion of distinct artistic identities, even as coupled sculptors. Their resettlement in Toronto during the winter of 1912 was encouraged by Loring's parents, who had been horrified by their decision to set up shop in Greenwich Village, a bohemian neighborhood seen as hedonistic and unruly. The couple certainly stood out in the genteel Torontonian atmosphere. They were both known to wear trousers, baggy coats, men's shoes, and moth-eaten berets as they promenaded around the city. In 1920, the pair somewhat sardonically moved into an old-school church in Moore Park, which they repurposed into a home and studio. Their moving in proved to be quite a scandal, as their biographer recounts, quote, "The sight of 2 trousered women chopping wood, rolling stones around, hammering nails, and unloading nude sculptures into the building threw the area residents into a state of alarm," end quote. Their friends Charles Ashley and James Crippen, a gay couple from Chicago who ran a popular photography studio, lived just 1 block away. Ashley and Crippen donned the epithet the boys, just as Loring and Weil were known as the girls. The successful careers of the 2 same-sex couples in Toronto suggest that although they certainly faced disapproval and stigma, they also benefited from a certain degree of tolerance. The church studio at 110 Glenrose Avenue would serve as a hub for the arts in Toronto, where Loring and Weil often hosted soirees and salons and welcomed frequent visits from the famed group of the group of 7, the famed cohort of Canadian landscape painters. And soon they would begin to address themselves as the Loring Weils, as if a newly married couple had moved in to the rickety church. The outbreak of World War I resulted in their first governmental commissions, and this governmental relationship would be enduring, a sort of peculiar manifestation of lesbian nationalism. At the advice of Eric Brown, director of National Gallery of Canada, the sculptors were approached to produce work for the Canadian War Memorials Fund art collection. They seized this opportunity to depict women's contributions on the home front, producing 11 bronze statuettes of industrial and agricultural working women. The statuettes are strikingly androgynous. The Canadian art historian Christina Huneau has stated that, from a distance, the workers represented do not seem to be women at all. Loring's The Furnace Girl, for example, works hard to distort traditional gender signifiers. The workers' baggy clothing and working cap de-emphasize secondary sexual characteristics, and Loring constructs an angular, masculinized facial structure. Loring and Willis's contributions radically disrupted conventional depictions of women in Canadian art at a moment when the dramatic discursive shift of the term woman itself. The publication Women in the Production of Munitions in Canada, produced by the Imperial Munitions Board, boasted that, quote, "There is no operation on shell work that a woman cannot do, and as a matter of fact is not doing, even the heavy operations which require great physical strain," end quote, a statement in marked contrast to earlier Victorian models of womanhood. As Huneau has argued, the artist capitalized on this commission to challenge the hegemonic, binaristic system of gender representation that predominated Canadian art. They continued to collaborate with the Canadian government, and in 1927, Weil was invited to travel to British Columbia to produce images of totem poles, or just poles, as the word totem is a misnomer, in the Skeena River Valley with fellow artist Anne Savage. They were participating in a process known as settler indigenization, the gestures by which a transplanted people reimagine themselves as native to the land which they choose to call home, claiming indigenous culture on behalf of the settler state. While I have emphasized the prejudice and obstacles faced by the women and gender nonconforming artists in this presentation, it's significant to note that their status as white settlers often afforded them privileges inaccessible to indigenous peoples in a context of colonial exploitation. The categories Canadian and lesbian employed in this essay are moreover fundamentally European in origin, and their operation in the land known as Turtle Island evinces this settler colonial status. As many scholars have demonstrated, the settlement of French and British Canada was enacted through sex and gendered violence, and produced strongly regulated modes of control over indigenous genders and sexualities. Further, settler colonial tactics have historically targeted indigenous women, children, and two-spirited people in an effort to fracture the social fabric of indigenous cultures and their relationship to land. The British Columbian artist Emily Carr, celebrated for her post-impressionistic canvases depicting forests and First Nation cultures, exemplifies this settler indigenization complex. She wrote late in life, quote, "Perhaps I shall never do anything beyond my Indian stuff, because it struck into my vitals when I was freshly maturing into young womanhood, and my senses were keenly alert. The wild places and primitive people claimed me," end quote. As many commenters have noted, Carr envisioned herself as an outsider artist in settler society and identified with the othered indigenous people of the Northwest Coast. Some have also interpreted this outsider identity as a sign that Carr was in fact a lesbian. Bruce LaBruce has called her, quote, "the great ambiguously lesbian Canadian artist." Unlike Carlyle, Loring, and Weil, however, Carr was never in a long-term committed relationship with a man nor a woman, and the biographical evidence is weaker, and her oeuvre is less persistently sapphic. Nonetheless, her landscapes have often been described as highly sensuous and sublimated, and the proposition that she expressed lesbian desire through her work would make for an interesting psychoanalytic study. For Carr, the natural world was fundamentally female. She described as mountains as voluptuous, corsetless women, and utilized she-her pronouns for trees. In her anthropomorphic tree trunk of 1931, for example, we can thus assume that Carr envisions the tree as feminine, despite its phallic quality. One commenter has described the painting as depicting a very seductive, very feminine woman with upright posture. Ultimately, the embodied and yonic elements that pervade Carr's work are tempting to read as queer, but they admittedly remain ambiguous. Two key questions of this presentation have been, who and what was lesbian? Who and what was Canadian? Although born and raised in the region we now consider a monolithic Canadian state, Florence Carlyle studied in France, lived in New York, and settled in England. Loring and Weil were American-born, but adopted Canadian identities, establishing the Sculptors' Society of Canada in 1928. None of them ever adopted a public lesbian identity, yet their sexualities and their partnerships with women remain key to understanding their work and to writing their histories. Like their national identities, I want to suggest that their sexual identities were similarly malleable and existed within a wider network of complex identifications. My point is that the modern rigid identities of lesbian and Canadian had not yet crystallized in early 20th century Canada, and that these artists saw these identities as more fungible than indissoluble. During a period in which their love was subject to compulsory silence, these artists also understood that, concessionally, their art could remain a site of cautious articulation. A poet by the name of Elsie Gidlow, represents the first generation of out lesbians in Canada. Gidlow was born in 1898 in England and moved to Montreal in 1904. With Roswell George Mills, she published a revolutionary, openly gay magazine, Les Mouches Fantastiques, from 1918 to 1920, as an outlet of amateur journalism. Les Mouches Fantastiques translates to The Fantastic Flies. It is one of the very first openly gay magazines published in North America. The most notable critic of the magazine was none other than H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote in his own magazine, The Conservative, that Gidlow and Mills were stifled by their quote-unquote bondage to the lower regions of the senses. Gidlow, whom Mills referred to as Sappho, addressed her love poems directly to women. They read and were inspired by Edward Carpenter and Oscar Wilde, and envisioned themselves as the inheritors of an ancient queer tradition spanning from the Greeks to Shakespeare, Michelangelo, and Walt Whitman. Gidlow reflected that her time studying with Mills permitted her to, quote, find a credible space for myself between the rigidities of male and female. I now saw a spectrum of gender not crudely defined by bodily sex characteristics, but psychological and emotional gradations flowing into one another, freeing the individual from arbitrary, prescribed roles, end quote. In 1923, she published On a Gray Thread, a groundbreaking volume of sapphic poetry. Her poem, Love's Sleep, begins, watch my love in sleep, is she not beautiful as a young flower at night, weary and glad with dew? Pale curved body that I have kissed too much, warm with slumber's flush. Breasts like mounded snow, too small for children's mouths. Lips a red spring bud, my love will bring to bloom. Gidlow's poetry represents a subsequent generation of North American lesbians for whom naming became a necessity, and for whom the closet no longer meant safety, but suffocation. Thank you.
Our next delightful speaker, Simon Martin, is director of Pallant House Gallery, a modern art museum in Chichester, UK. He has curated many exhibitions of 20th and 21st century British art, including monographic shows of Edward Burr, Peter Blake, Patrick Caulfield, John Minton, and P. Fawn, as well as thematic surveys such as Poets in the Landscape, The Romantic Spirit in British Art, Conflict and Conscience, British Artists in the Spanish Civil War, and Drawn to Nature, Gilbert White and the Artists. His monograph, Glenn Philpott, Flesh and Spirit, was published in 2022 to coincide with the first major exhibition on the artist in 40 years. And those of us who were lucky enough to hear Simon talk in front of the paintings yesterday, what is time? Sometime this week, can have a glimpse into what we're about to experience, which is going to be great. So friends, please welcome Simon to the presentation stage.
So, what a scary thing to have to be the very last person on a whole symposium, and I really apologise. You're probably all very, very tired. Firstly, I just want a huge thank you. It's been such a privilege to be here. Thank you, Jonathan, the Alphawood Foundation, and the team at Rightwood 659, in particular Johnny and Melissa, for a remarkable exhibition and such a stimulating symposium, and the invitation to come from the UK and to share some of my research. I have terrible imposter syndrome, so I apologise in advance. Right, so I'm going to try and work out this. So Glyn Philpott, the life and art of Glyn Philpott, who was a British artist, born in 1884, he died in 1937. It provides a fascinating case study in the representation of queer themes and identity in early 20th century British art, and the connections between Britain and France, Germany, and the USA, and particularly London, Chicago, and New York, Paris, and Berlin. My talk today is going to draw on the research that I did for an exhibition in 2022, Glyn Philpott, Flesh and Spirit, which took place at Pallant House Gallery, where I'm director. And that was the first museum exhibition in almost 40 years of his work. The last was at the National Portrait Gallery in 1984 and was accompanied by this monograph I wrote on the artist. In the first part of my talk, I want to focus on how the artist used what might be called the cloak of classicism to articulate queer themes in works that were exhibited in public spaces such as the Royal Academy in London, the Tate Gallery, but might be read and understood by queer viewers with more deeper meanings about identity. I will then look at Philpott's dramatic conversion to modernism in the 1930s, and subsequently on his representation of people of colour, and how these connect to wider phenomena such as the Harlem Renaissance. But I want to start with this painting that you'll all have seen in the exhibition. Since we're here in Chicago, to start with Chicago multi-millionaire Robert Allerton. And Philpott had a romantic relationship with him in 1913. They apparently met at the Royal Opera House in London, and he was invited by Allerton to go and stay with him at his Monticello estate, the Farms, which is not so far from Chicago. And he stayed there for 4 months. He fell deeply in love with Allerton, and he wrote to his sister Daisy in London that Allerton was everything that is beautiful and true. And he said, it's not just a silly infatuation I have for him. It's the one line in any letter that we have from Philpott where he really talks about a relationship and his feelings for another man. Philpott, he fell for him for, in a way, this is so interesting, of course. This is the Chicago Sunday Tribune. It describes him as the richest bachelor in Chicago. Now, in fact, Philpott spent his time here in Chicago painting the very heiresses who might have been hoping for Allerton's hand in marriage, people such as Isabel Stimson McBurney. These sorts of portraits, and the vast majority of Philpott's career were these sorts of portraits. I'm not going to show you any more than this one, but just to give you a sense of the work with which he made his money. They were his bread and butter in the in the 1910s and the 1920s. They made him the highest paid portrait painter in Britain after John Singer Sargent, who pretty much had stopped painting portraits in 1910. He was Philpott's next door neighbour in Tite Street, the street of wonderful possibilities in Chelsea. And incidentally, Philpott's studio was 30 and Sargent's was 31A. And I discovered this, I've discovered some letters I have at home, and I've never been able to read the signature, and I suddenly realised that it was Singer Sargent's address. And it was a letter about meeting for lunch. It was unfortunately nothing, no smoking gun in the letter. But that relationship with Allerton provides a good starting point for the key themes in Philpott's work, and that intersection between British and American and European queer art. They met just when Philpott's career was on a rapid ascent. He had been awarded a scholarship at Lambeth College of Art some years before. He came first out of over 100 students, and he subsequently studied, where do you think in Paris? The Académie Julienne, where everyone else today seems to have studied. And as Paveld noted and various others have noted, this was attended by numerous queer artists at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The lessons of his exposure to the art of Manet and Rodin are evident in his early work. For example, this 1906 sculpture, The Wrestlers, is clearly influenced by his study of Rodin's sculptures and is a fascinating queering of the erotic charge of heterosexual subject matter, such as Rodin's Kiss, whilst making reference also to Michelangelo's Wrestlers. Philpott clearly felt that this sculpture had a personal resonance for him. And in one of very few early photographs of Philpott, we see him posing in the studio, holding the original plaster up against his crotch. I mean, it's a kind of fascinating kind of work, in a way, that shows how important it was to him. It wasn't actually exhibited at this point in time, though. It wasn't cast until I think it was actually posthumously cast in bronze. So I don't think it was ever actually cast during his lifetime. It should be noted, of course, that Philpott was not primarily a sculptor. There are only 13 known sculptures from across his career. Principally, he aimed to become a modern old master, emulating the bravura handling of Titian, Velázquez, and the 19th century French painters such as Edouard Manet. It's interesting to note that Philpott's first major painting, Manuelito the Circus Boy, from 1909, was clearly inspired by a series of paintings by Manet of female models as toreadors, who were in turn heavily influenced by Philpott's hero, Velázquez. But Philpott makes clear that this is a fantasy. He's not pretending that Manuelito is actually a toreador, because you can see the edge of the canvas in the studio. This is a boy dressed up. It's not a pretense. It's a kind of revelation of its own making, in a way. And when Manuelito the Circus Boy was exhibited at the Modern Society of Portrait Painters in 1909, the Times called it quite the most striking modern picture in London, and the Evening News commented on Philpott's diabolical cleverness. It's quite an interesting phrase. It travelled to the Venice Biennale in 1910 and was one of the first modern paintings to be acquired by the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. The following year, so then in 1912, Philpott exhibited a now lost work called Tragedienne at the Art Institute of Chicago. And the year after that, he then won first prize at the Carnegie International Exhibition for his painting of his Italian model Luigi, who was also a servant to him in the house, model and servant. We see him topless, his shirt and braces hanging from his waist. The painting is actually now in the Muskegon Museum on the other side of Lake Michigan, across from Chicago. So let's return from this. It gives you a setting for why perhaps he attracted Robert Allerton's attention at this point in time. To return to the portrait of Allerton, it seems worth noting that although he was fairly assiduous about the titling of his portraits of society figures, this was only ever called The Man in Black. Philpott obscured his lover's identity, and it wasn't acquired by Allerton, but actually bought by a British collector and given to the Tate Gallery in London the following year, 1914. I mentioned before that Allerton had met Philpott at the Royal Opera House in London in 1912. That year, Philpott had painted the first known depiction of Vasilev Nijinsky performing with Serge Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. This is the first depiction on the London stage, I should say, as the Faun in L'Après-midi d'une Faune, which, as Pavel mentioned in his talk, was designed by the queer Russian artist Leon Bakst. So if Philpott and Allerton's meeting was indeed at this celebrated performance, which seems to be the case, it also seems that this leads to a queer coding of their relationship through the symbol of the faun. So here is Philpott's portrait of Allerton as a faun. It was recently discovered. It's one of these wonderful things that in the book I had a black and white photograph. Somebody came to the exhibition and bought the book, and on the train home they saw their picture, and then it came up at auction very soon afterwards. As what tends to happen. So he depicts him as a faun. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see an overmantel in Allerton's home in Monticello, which Philpott also painted. This was sadly, I think, destroyed in a hurricane in Hawaii. But here, on the left-hand side, you can get a better view of it. And so you have this faun and satire in a rather intense, let's call it a face-off. And it should be noted that classicism was a language that Philpott started to adopt for his portraiture of society figures at this point in time. For example, another lost picture from 1921, his portrait of Kate Lancaster Brewster. She was the wife of a Chicago businessman and a donor to the Art Institute of Chicago, and he painted her amongst a number of other society hostesses on his return to Chicago in 1921, painting in a neoclassical style that pays homage to Jacques-Louis David. And during the 1920s and the early 1920s, of course, there's a wider return to order after the First World War. You see it in the work, of course, Picasso, Derain, and various others. Philpott paints a series of works based on Greco-Roman mythological subjects. And I think what's quite interesting is that exactly the same moment that James Joyce publishes Ulysses in Paris in 1922, Philpott is in Italy painting his version of the same myth. But of course, it doesn't take a usual narrative approach. As you can see here, it was very carefully constructed. His preparatory drawings reveal where he wants the focus of our attention to be. And despite the title, let's look at one of the other drawings, his preparatory drawings. I mean, he of course worked in a way, he studied the old masters and he constructed his pictures in exactly that way, squaring up, working from sanguine drawings. Despite its title, it would be hard to argue that Penelope, who in the myth, Homer's Odyssey, is waiting for the return. I'll go back to the picture. I've given away my... it's hard to argue that Penelope, who's waiting for Ulysses, and she's weaving and unpicking her shroud for Telemachus, is really the subject of this work at all. She's so incidental to the narrative. And if we go forward, here to look at this detail, Philpott draws our eye into the buttocks of her male suitor, placing a tiny blue flower immediately before them. And it's also worth noting, of course, that Penelope's suitors don't seem to be that into her, frankly. The other works from this time, such as Melampus and the Centaur, depicts a fairly obscure figure from classical mythology, a soothsayer, and he was the introducer of the worship of Dionysus. Here you have him as a kind of twinky youth with a daddy bear centaur. It shows a clear reference to one of the male Ignudo from the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo, another of Philpott's great heroes. And a similar, thematically similar kind of iconography of young males, a satyr and an older bearded centaur appears in Philpott's Repose on the Flight into Egypt from the same year. It's worth noting that Philpott had converted to Catholicism some years earlier, but it's fair to say that his religious imagery moved seamlessly between pagan and Christian imagery, between solidly Christian imagery and homoerotic imagery. And here, for example, you have the resting figures of Mary and Joseph and the Christ child. Again, they're almost incidental to this narrative, just as Penelope is. Compared to, on the other side, perhaps the most phallic cactus in art history. I don't know whether Georgia O'Keeffe did any others, but strategically placed to cover over the centaur's own phallus. And given this subject matter, it's worth asking whether these queer themes in such works were recognised by critics and public audiences at this time. And a clue to this question is provided by a 1920s caricature of Philpott by Powers Evans. This is a work called Journey of the Spirit from 1921, and here we have a caricature by Powers Evans, and of course you see the quotation from Journey of the Spirit here. The figure on the left is actually holding an apple in Evans's cartoon, whilst Philpott holds a strategically placed classical torso. And in fact, that torso was a sculpture that he had actually sculpted. And so here, Philpott's interest in the classical male nude would seem to be shorthand for expressing his queer identity. In his 1930 sculpture, Echo and Narcissus, the figure of Narcissus is physically separate from the female myth, the nymph, Echo. And as Johnny mentioned, of course, his to bring a nymph into the lecture, it was originally displayed on a mirror to emphasise Narcissus's onanistic kind of interest in the male form. Philpott, of course, would have been aware of Sigmund Freud's writings, and particularly through Havelock Ellis's writings on sexual identity, which we heard about in the previous talk. Philpott's explorations of the Narcissus myth relate to a series of murals he painted in 1930 for his patrons, Lord and Lady Melchett, who, footnote here, look them up because they had a very, very interesting ménage à trois kind of relationship. This was really one of the most spectacular Art Deco interiors in London at that time, and it was widely reported in various different publications. The murals also featured Echo and Narcissus and featured depictions of Leda copulating with a swan, as well as Oedipus and the Sphinx, which you can see on the left-hand side. Another classical Freudian subject to which I'll return to shortly. As Dijkstra, thank you, has asserted, Narcissus in his self-obsession was the epitome of effeminacy, of the ephebe, and it appeared in the work, of course, of symbolist poets and artists. And Freud had written in his introductory lecture of how homosexual object choice lies closer to narcissism than does the heterosexual kind, a strong libidinal fixation to the narcissistic type of object choice to be included in the predisposition to manifest homosexuality. It's clear that the sculpture of Narcissus was also the basis of a painting depicting the risen Christ, on which Philpott was working at the same time. This is called Resurgam from 1930. And here the figure of Christ rising from the tomb is beardless, scantily clad, very unlike the prototype for this painting, which is by the Italian Renaissance artist Piero della Francesco. And whilst the sleeping soldiers on this side, of course, on this side he covers his face with he covers his eyes with his hands. So that's Philpott's classicism and religion. So I want to now look at how he moves to become a modernist. So here he is with Henri Matisse. The Art Deco murals, works such as Resurgam, they signified a move in a different direction from those earlier works. And Philpott in 1930 was invited to be a judge for the Carnegie International exhibition. He travelled to America with Matisse on the Mauritania. He described Matisse as being quite nice, not very, and rather dry. And he and his fellow judges awarded the first prize to Pablo Picasso's celebrated painting of his wife Olga. I'm sure you can all picture it. And during that trip, he spent time in New York. He visited the jazz clubs in Harlem, which is a key thing we'll come back to. After his trip to the USA with Matisse, Philpott came to re-evaluate his position as an artist, and he abandoned pretty much the highly lucrative portrait painting he'd been doing. He relocates to Paris, and he takes a studio in Montparnasse and makes at least 2 visits to Berlin. And you can see the influence of this trip immediately. He'd been that year, he'd actually represented Britain at the Venice Biennale in 1930. Journey of the Spirit, for example, was one of the works shown in Venice when he represented Britain. The paintings that he created in Paris reveal the impact of seeing Neue Sachlichkeit paintings which were shown in the German pavilion that year in 1930. So we know that he will have seen those. He may well have also seen them in Berlin. And you suddenly get works like this. It's a very different kind of imagery. He writes to his sister Daisy, "Daisy, darling, I'm sorry if I sound mysterious about Berlin. You'll be thinking that I've been wallowing in vice." Years later, she writes that her brother had been persuaded, much against his inclinations and wishes, by a friend to see something of the underworld of Berlin. Philpott, in his own letters, is less reticent. And one of the great things, of course, about being able to use the internet is you can work out from the dates and when envelopes are stamped. And I realised that the person that wrote Philpott's biography, everything was in the wrong order. And it's wonderful because you suddenly start to get a very different picture. And he writes, "In Berlin, it seemed impossible to get time or to know how to begin. I can't even begin to tell you how strange and wonderful it was. We stayed up all night, every night, and slept or bathed in the day. But I can't express how glad I am that I went, for I believe I shall work better for having seen sides of human nature which I have never looked on before." So he takes a studio in the Boulevard Raspail, designed by the architect Bruno L. Herculen, and he has this live workspace, and it starts to appear as the backdrop in his paintings from this time. So, for example, St. Sebastian. You can actually see, if I go back, I think he had this one here. If you look at the glass of the window frames and then look at St. Sebastian, you can actually see that he's tied to the window frame. He's actually in the window. It shows, of course, the patron saint of homosexuals pierced with arrows, and the model was a German youth called Karl-Heinz Müller, who Philpott had met in Berlin. This is them in the Tiergarten with lions. Interestingly, Karl-Heinz was also a regular feature in the Berlin life of the British author Christopher Isherwood, whose novel Goodbye to Berlin was adapted as the film Cabaret. And he's one of a number of young men with whom Isherwood has a sexual relationship. And in fact, he writes in a letter to Stephen Spender about Karl-Heinz's nasty dose of clap. We don't know whether he passed it on to Philpott, but if we look at view, again, you can see the view through the window out onto the Boulevard Raspail. These sorts of surrealist works, in a way. Karl-Heinz is repeated, of course, a couple of times in this work, together with a figure of Minerva. But I want to go from this work to perhaps the most important manifestation of Philpott's exploration of explicitly queer classical themes. This is his painting Oedipus from 1931-2, which is now in the National Gallery Victoria in Australia. And it shows Oedipus, of course, face to face with the Theban Sphinx. It's clear that the partial inspiration for this painting was the classical subject from paintings by artists such as Ingres, as well as symbolist artists and poets. But the Sphinx is based absolutely on Jacob Epstein's tomb of Oscar Wilde in the Cimetière de Montparnasse, which was very close to Philpott's studio. That, of course, was inspired by Wilde's poem, The Sphinx, an account of homosexual yearning. But the tomb, with its angel based on an Assyrian man-bull, had been commissioned by Robbie Ross, who was a great friend of Philpott, and he, of course, was Wilde's literary executor. And indeed, when Epstein had carved this, he had a studio in Tite Street where Philpott was then living, so he absolutely, if he didn't see it in Paris, which he would have done, would have seen it being made. Now, in the final section of my talk, I want to address Philpott's representation of men of colour in his work across his career. This is an area which received a great deal of attention at the time of the exhibition and the publication of my book. This was an article in the New York Times in July 2022, which focused in on the approach I took to researching the lives of Philpot's black sitters and the consultation that I undertook with a variety of stakeholders. Jonathan kindly, for example, took part in some of those workshops. And in relation to the project, I kind of undertook to retitle his entire oeuvre, because why not? And really to reinscribe the models' names and identities where they're known, but trying to follow the original titling structures. And I had the benefit of Philpot's record books to actually be able to trace everything. So this is a work. Unfortunately, with this one, I did not know. I was unable to uncover the name of the model. So this is Portrait of a Black Man from 1912. So we have to go back in time here. At the time of the exhibition, this work was considered lost and had not been seen in a century, since 1923. I just had a black and white photograph of it, but due to the extensive provenance research, I managed to locate it. I actually I found the name of somebody who'd owned it, who had the same name as somebody who was in an allotment association in Yorkshire, and someone passed on the email, and it turned out that their nephew had been named after them and actually owned the picture. It was quite extraordinary. In this and other paintings of black models from the 1910s, Philpot painted his models in a manner that was compared to Rembrandt and the Dutch old masters. Unlike the majority of his 18th and 19th century artistic precursors, Philpot did not depict his black sitters as servants or as slaves, nor as stereotypes. Rather than pushing them to the margins as secondary figures in subservient roles, they're entirely the focus and the subject of the work, and they're rendered with dignity and with individuality. Whilst I couldn't uncover the identity of this sitter, I did manage to find that one of Philpot's first black models was called Billy. He was from Ethiopia, and after this work was exhibited at the Modern Portrait Society, Madam X in the Chicago Sunday Tribune notes that Philpot's, and this is a quote here, "great admiration for the Negro from the painter's point of view. The most striking thing at last spring's Academy in London was a painting of an Ethiopian in a gorgeous coat that came out of Sargent's studio. Mr. Philpot's forte is colour, though as a draftsman it is not to be overshadowed." You can see that Ikat robe, Ikat Chapin robe, mentioned by Madame X. As previously mentioned, Sargent was Philpot's next door neighbour, and that work was subsequently acquired in 1913 by the National Gallery of Canada in Ontario. Philpot's sensitive, obviously it's very much in the Orientalist genre, Philpot's sensitive depictions of black sitters would have been an unusual sight in exhibitions at this time. They provide a rare visual representation of the black population in Britain, which is estimated to be about 10,000 in 1914, mainly centred in London, and mainly having emigrated from parts of the British Empire. Philpot employed a small number of largely unidentified black models in 1913-14. Another of them is here. And just as Philpot paid careful attention to the effect of light on skin, he seems to have relished the suitability of bronze as a medium for depicting a darker skinned subject, as with his Mask of a Black Man, which seems to depict the same model. And it should be noted that Philpot he'd owned a cast of Philpot's 1882 bronze man with a broken nose. And as with The Wrestlers and Rodin's Kiss, he may have been seeking to reimagine the qualities of Rodin's portrait busts with a non-white subject. Now, as Niharika outlined in her talk earlier, the title of his 1922 painting, L'après-midi tunisien, connects to Stéphane Mallarmé and the Diaghilev Ballet Russe, which Philpott had earlier depicted. The male homoerotic exchange in this painting is a modern take on the 19th century genre of Orientalist paintings by salon painters such as Jean-Léon Gérôme, Eugène Delacroix and Frederick Lewis. The carnation, of course, is sometimes called the flower of love, and as we see here, one has it tucked behind his ear and the other holds one. Now, as a Catholic, Philpott may have been thinking of biblical absolution and God's forgiveness of Rahab, because if you go back here, you see this red thread hanging down behind one figure. And in the Bible, the cord of red thread is used by Rahab, quote unquote, the harlot, as a sign to invaders to keep her family safe in the storming of Jericho. This is a supposition, I don't know. Now, Philpott made several trips to North Africa in the 1920s and 30s, and in 1923 he painted the now lost official portrait of King Fuad of Egypt. He was paid an astonishing £3,000, which equates to hundreds of thousands of pounds today. And whilst in Tunisia, he sees a muscular man called Ali Ben Amour Ben Murad working on a road in 1920. He arranges for him to come to England to work as a model and manservant. And on collecting in Paris, Philpott outfits him in suitable attire. Let's read, Orientalist attire. And he writes that he at once conducted himself with great ease, intelligence and dignity. He dresses him in a fez and Arab robes, but Ali Ben is a very talented pugilist, and he begins boxing in Soho until he gets in trouble with police, and so Philpott actually had to send him back to Tunisia. So I want to go on to another of his models, key model, which is Henry Thomas. And in around 1928-29, Philpott takes on a new model and servant, a man named Henry Thomas. He was the grandson of freed slaves. And I discovered in the New York US arriving passenger and crew lists for 1922 that he's listed as being born in St Anne's, Trelawney in Jamaica in 1900. He departed Port Arthur as a stowaway aboard the SS Commodore Rowlands, and which arrived into New York in July 1922, and the destination is anywhere. So he becomes a stoker on a steamship. He ends up in Britain. He misses his ship, and supposedly Philpott finds him sleeping in the National Gallery. That's the recorded version. Philpott, arguably Henry Thomas, and this painting of course is in the exhibition, Henry Thomas becomes Philpott's, let's call it his muse in a way, for the next 8 years, posing for him right up until the artist's death in 1937. In 1928, his portrait as Balthazar, one of the three magi, was exhibited at the Royal Academy, one of the only work, I think, of a black subject at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition that year, amongst portraits, of course, of aristocracy, politicians, and celebrities. In this work, Philpott leaves out the Holy Family entirely. He leaves out the other magi. He focuses in on Balthazar in heroic and almost cinematic terms. And at the same time, he made another Rodin-esque sculpture. Of course, if you've been to the Art Institute of Chicago, you'll have seen The Walking Man. There are various other versions in other places. Philpott, you can see it's very identifiably Henry. By all accounts, Henry was not, he was a wonderful model. He was not an effective manservant, I think. He could barely boil an egg, by all accounts. But he had a lot of anxiety around the housekeeper. Philpott had a country house in Sussex, a kind of Baynard's Manor. And he was constantly thinking up ways to make him feel comfortable, giving him jobs in the garden, things like this, because he was frightened around the housekeeper. Now, there are, of course, shall we say, colonial undertones, overtones, to the power dynamics of that relationship. We don't know whether there was a sexual element to the relationship. Well, there are accounts of Philpot Henry wandering around the house naked, but that not happening when Philpot's sisters were visiting, for example. But I think one of the other things to bear in mind with this, is Philpot's approach to the representation of his sitters. And I think one of the most exciting discoveries for me whilst working on the show was to find Philpot's portrait of Paul Robeson, the African-American actor. He was, again, in the Art Institute of Chicago, of course, there is the portrait of Ira Aldrich playing Othello. That was played by white actors blacking up after Ira Aldrich until 1930, when Robeson played him. Philpot took his nieces, and I knew Philpot's niece, she was 90 when she died in 2003. He took his nieces. We also know that Philpot invited Paul Robeson to dinner, and Robeson came, presumably Henry Thomas was serving that night, and that Robeson sang quote-unquote Negro spirituals. So there's definitely and what's so interesting about this is that the costumes were designed by Sheringham, who was a great friend of Philpot's. And so by going through the photographs, I was able to kind of, this picture, which as you can see, the title was just, I found it in a sale catalogue from decades ago, just as Head of a Negro. But it's one of the key things here, of course, is that Robeson was closely associated with the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. Philpot, and I haven't included it here, but it's lost. I have a photograph of Philpot also painted Roland Hayes, the African-American tenor. If you know where this picture is, let me know, because no one in Hayes's family knows. But it's so interesting that in the 1920s he paints them, and of course Hayes again is a kind of poster figure for the Harlem Renaissance. As I mentioned, when Philpot visited New York in 1930, he visited Harlem. He went out, as far as we know, he went to jazz clubs in Harlem. And whilst in Paris, he then paints pictures such as this. This is Tom Whiskey, Monsieur Julien Zaire, from 1931. I found two of the pictures. There's another one which is still missing, of a French Caribbean cabaret performer who I found was from Martinique. He was called Julien Zaire. His stage name is Tom Whiskey. And there are films from this time depicting some of those cabaret nightclubs in Paris, and of course famously people like Josephine Baker and others. The Bal Blomet, I've actually identified someone who I actually think in the films of the Bal Blomet is actually Julien Zaire. It was just around the corner from Philpot's flat, and Philpot's flat, of course, also forms the backdrop to these extraordinary images. Now, Philpot's paintings, and this is the other one with the reverse title, Monsieur Julien Zaire, Tom Whiskey. These are Philpot's titles, not mine, I should add here. And again, in this incredibly, Philpot filled the apartment with Bauhaus furniture. It was such, and his country house in England, I should note, was entirely filled with a kind of timber-framed country house aesthetic. He was adopting a very, very different identity and persona here in Paris. And I want to show, of course, the wonderful work from the Smithsonian Institute, Vinold Rice's portrait of Langston Hughes, the Black Poet, because it's a very, very similar aesthetic and idiom.
We tried to get it for this exhibition.
Did you?
And it was displayed at the Met. So
okay. Well, here it is. When you go back to these works. Now, Philpott wrote to... So Philpott's paintings conform to the notion of the new Negro as defined by the African-American theorist Alain Locke. He spoke of a new psychology and a new spirit, and of how art, I quote here, art must discover and reveal the beauty which prejudice and caricature have overlaid. Philpott wrote to a friend of how Julien writes from Nice that he's had real success there. There is a new bit of colour here now, for before going to Nice, Julien procured for me, in the most innocent sense of that word, the doorkeeper of the Tagada. Do you remember him? In red. He comes in often now and keeps the black flag flying here at 216 while Julien is away. Seriously, I have done a very good head of him. And the Tagada Beguine was a cabaret club in Montparnasse, known for its French Creole music. It had interiors by Paul Collin, who was known for his depictions of Josephine Baker. This, of course, is reminiscent of Neue Sachlichkeit imagery, and in particular the Harlem Renaissance artist Archibald J. Motley, who didn't exactly overlap, although they almost did in Paris, as far as I can work out. Here, of course, the female to the right with the garçon haircut is rather like Sally Bowles in Cabaret, actually. If we follow the eyes, though, of course, we realise there's a kind of triangulated recognition between the man behind who looks out over his cocked hat and the doorman's gaze. That same model, of course, as that letter reveals, this is probably the painting that Philpott was writing about in that letter, and of course you have it here in the exhibition. What's also interesting about this is, of course, Gauguin's wonderful portrait of a man, Tahitian man with a hibiscus, which was owned by Henri Matisse. And so it seems likely that Philpott might have seen it at Matisse's. I have no record of a visit there, though. He maintained, and this is the other one, the astonishing... this is actually how I first got to find out about Philpott, when I saw it in Sotheby's. He maintained a studio in Paris. In fact, he took on Picasso's former studio. Although from 1934, he was largely focused on painting Henry Thomas at Baynard's Manor, and this is one of the works from 1934. It becomes clear that Henry is central to Philpott's identity in the 1930s, from 1933-34 onwards. And in 1934, there's a staged series of photographs taken in advance of the artist's one-man exhibition at the Leicester Galleries, which every single one features Henry together with Philpott. They're perhaps troubling, I think, because they present a formal, or this one presents a formal white-gloved subservient relationship that seeks to reinscribe clear boundaries between artist and model, servant and master. But of course, the paintings seem to kind of cut through this, these demarcations, and I don't quite understand exactly what is going on here. But to go very quickly through the final series of works, of course, Henry Thomas sitting back view, a reference to Ingres' Odalisque, but also, of course, Man Ray, and Melancholy Man, Henry Thomas. And I want to finish with this work. It's Philpott's final painting. Henry Thomas's eyes appear watery, as if full of emotion and on the verge of tears. It's a portrait that's imbued with dignity and with emotion. And when Philpott died in 1937 following a heart attack, a requiem mass was held at Westminster Cathedral, but only his patron, Lord Benneil, his immediate family and Henry Thomas were present at the burial. And in a poignant note left with a bouquet on the artist's grave, Henry writes, "For memory to my dear master as well as my father and brother to me. God bless him and forgive him for his kind heart and human nature from his poor servant Henry." I think it's a very revealing note to leave on a grave. Alongside his society portraits and subject paintings, Philpott created a space for the sensitive representation of the black male, not as a racist stereotype, but as a beautiful, modern, and elevated to the aesthetic ideal of the nude and portrait in Western culture. And in doing so, Philpott creates a significant visual record relating to gender and other voices of modernism in early 20th century art and culture. As a queer man, Philpott was a social outsider himself, so it's tempting to believe that he identified with an outsider of a different sort. In an account written in a concentration camp during the Second World War by his friend Julian Hall, Julian Hall wrote of a painting of a black model by Philpott. He said, "His head is carried high." I'm going to go back to this one because I think it's this. "His head is carried high. He is young, his dress is not European, but I forget its colour and style. The glance of his eyes I do not forget. In the darkness of his face it has an ardent glow, gentle, solemn, easily disturbed, like the naked flame of a candle. The eyes of a model I do not know, but something of Philpott himself looks out of them, a Philpott who never comes to London, but may not have feared to reveal himself to men whose skins were black." Thank you.
One of the thoughts that I had that you would both answer in quite different ways, but you've both been involved in this project for so long, is with the vantage point of the end of the symposium, as well as the installed exhibition that you've gotten to see and live with, don't start dying. What insights have you had about the theme or themes that you didn't have prior to seeing the show and listening to the symposium? Were there any surprises or things that adjusted your thinking from where it was when you started the project? Or something that you'd like to respond to that was raised earlier by seeing the whole show finally home?
Johnny, of course, has been completely involved in everything. I think the thing for me which is astonishing is the global reach of the exhibition. That this is an exhibition that makes connections across continents, and so many of my favourite works are in this exhibition, which is wonderful to see. But also artists I've never heard of, and that, frankly,
does it happen very often?
Exactly. So many museums and so many galleries are doing they're following blockbusters. They're giving people what they think they want, rather than what they don't know they want. People might have an idea about what they're coming to see at an exhibition like this, but actually they'll be given so much of what they didn't know they want. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what a show should do. It's delivering something very timely. Those connections, I think, are powerful. And I think actually all of the talks that we've had here that provide different ways of thinking about, a lot of these things we might think that we know, and we really don't. I've been quite challenged, how much vast amounts I didn't know, which is good.
Yeah, it's exciting. You can skip it if you want.
No, I'm just going to answer this question in a kind of different way, and I'm going to say that working on this project has confirmed what I believe to be true, which is that there is a vast, vast, vast history of queer and trans art globally. It exists, it is palpable, and it has just simply been erased systematically. And this project is here to recover it.
Johnny, this is more a question for you. You brought up the photo of those poles, and you mentioned a policy, I might be misremembering, so you can correct me, a Canadian policy of white settlements to encourage white settlement?
Settler indigenization, is that what?
Yeah, that's right. I was wondering if you could tell us more about that policy and how the artists were involved in that.
Yeah, so settler indigenization, it wasn't necessarily an explicit policy of the government, but it was more of a technique and a tactic that continues to be used by the Canadian government to this day to sort of appropriate indigenous art and iconography such as poles as products of the Canadian state, as symbols of the Canadian state, and it's this sort of perverse reclamation of Indigenous culture as national symbols. So they would often hire artists and send them, to example, to the Northwest Coast, to British Columbia, to make paintings and sculptures and drawings of Indigenous cultures. And they often depicted these cultures as, dying cultures, as cultures that were in the active process of disappearing, rather than perpetuating this myth of the quote unquote disappearing Indian. So yeah, it was really just a process that they would recruit artists to do so. And so the term settler indigenization is a contemporary theoretical term that we are now using to describe these historical practices.
Johnny and Simon, thank you both so much for two fantastic talks. I kind of want to, I was struck by both of your talks that, having just come out of a colonialism panel, that in both of your papers are dealing with, in some respects, Anglo, North American artists intersecting in various ways is with colonialism, whether it's in Paris, through the movement of formerly enslaved figures or through settler indigeneity. I think what I want to think about, Johnny, I was really struck, what you said, there's an incredible history of queer and trans art and we're here to recuperate it, and I think that's true. But I think in listening to both of your talks, I think it's also important for us as queer art historians to be critical of these figures as well, right? Lesbian nationalism, the complicities of queer aesthetics with projects like settler colonialism. And so I guess I would just like to hear you speak a little bit more about that. Simon, I think I was particularly, some incredible works that you showed us. And I think, I'm wondering if, this kind of binary that I see often art historians fall into in talking about portraiture between racist caricature bad, sensitive representation good. I'm wondering if that's a little simple. I'm wondering can actually the aestheticization of these subjects in portraiture actually grease the wheels of colonial thinking and aestheticize exploitation in a way. It strikes me, for example, that these portraits don't carry his name, which means that the social function of these portraits are very different, right, than they would be.
Yes and yes.
I would just love to hear you speak more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I kind of agree. And it's a, and this is the interesting thing. In holding an exhibition, in holding the first exhibition for 4 decades, comes a lot of responsibility. And I think particularly at the moment at which the exhibition happened in 2022, in 2020, my board of trustees were saying that exhibition has to be cancelled. We can't go there, we don't want the controversy. And I said, actually, we have to have a space for nuance here. There are very few artists from the 1920s and 30s who are doing what Philpott did. Now, I would not stand in front of you all and say, he's perfect, because the complexity, I think, is what makes it interesting. And I think the staging, the public staging of that relationship is very different, and I probably should have put in some of the non-public photographs of Henry in the house and things like this, because he certainly wasn't wearing white gloves in those photographs. So there's a lot of performativity going on for the press. And partly, the other thing I didn't mention in the talk is Philpott had a kind of partner through this period who actually committed suicide the day after Philpott's death, although it's quite hard to read that relationship in a meaningful way because I don't think they were actually living together for most of the time. But again, how do we inscribe on relationships from a century ago an understanding of those that they can be all kinds of different things? There are works by Philpott. There is, and I think he had very particular views on religion and spirituality, which I think we would probably find quite problematic today. So, for example, I think he was very well intentioned. So there's a work which I didn't put in the book called The Black Madonna, and it's an astonishing work where he depicts an African Madonna with kind of tribal figures around, with a kind of Christ child-like scenario. But to contemporize this is very awkward, I think. His ideas about a kind of sense of authentic spiritual kind of being and things like this, I think we'd find quite problematic. So, I think, and he of course was the product of his times as well, and that's the other thing that we have to understand. I think one of the things, the other thing I think which is quite interesting is how he takes Orientalist tropes, the harem guard. If you look at Gaydar with Felix standing outside the Gaydar nightclub, he's absolutely like a Jean-Léon Gérôme harem guard. So all of those things, is he doing knowingly? Is it subconscious? I don't have the answer to that, because of course he didn't write on those sorts of things. But in relation to Orientalism, there's a lot to unpick there.
Johnny, I had a question kind of towards you in regards to Florence Carlyle. That image that came up on the screen of, kind of cropped hair and a tie. First thing I saw, I was like, that person's a trans person. And then, two slides later, you say, and then goes by the name Carl, and I was like,
I know.
So, do you have any other indications or allusions? I mean, transmasculine people are practically invisible.
I know.
Today,
that's another thing that honestly I want to develop further in the text, is incorporating more trans theory. I think I wrote this when I was a graduate student. I started working on this when I was a graduate student, and I started really focusing on these lesbian historical methodologies. And I think one of the ways I want to work on growing the talk is incorporating more trans theory into it, because I think that's totally true. Like, lesbian history is also, but I don't think they're separate, right? Like, lesbian and trans history, right? I think that's one of the things I want to work on with the talk, is because also Florence Wilde too. We don't have their diaries or their letters. So of course we don't have this like explicit written thing saying, I identify as masculine, blah, blah, blah. But we do have visual evidence, and as I mentioned during the talk, I think, and as we've mentioned at this conference, visual evidence is just as valuable.
Is evidence.
Is evidence, exactly. And yeah, I really appreciate that comment, because that's the next step for this talk in this project, is incorporating more of that. And I think you're totally right.
Yes, Stephen Jones, a couple of questions for Simon. You mentioned my buddy Archibald Motley, and he thought of himself as a very proud Chicagoan, in spite of what the Metropolitan Museum tried to say about the
That's right.
Harlem Renaissance exhibit. Look for the Roland Hayes portrait at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York. And my question is about what you see as the symbolism of the dress that Philpott used for Henry Thomas in the various work where he does have clothes on.
Yes. So I guess it depends on which works, because actually there are works which I haven't shown today, where he places Henry, for example, in a completely white robe, which is very much he's obviously thinking about Christian symbolism. And there's Henry sitting there with wine and bread alongside, and it's very much kind of a biblical reading. And I think one of the things you never see in any of the paintings Henry entirely nude. And even in the sculptures of him, the walking Jamaican man, he's wearing a kind of thong-like thing with his penis sliced off. And I think one of the interesting things, obviously a lot of the drawings are in the Courtauld, but there is a self-inscribed reticence to engage with Henry's sexual organs in depicting them. And of course, actually, we're more likely to see Henry's bottom than we are his front in all of those works. So there's one of the things I would say is that Philpott is often, there are reversals often going on. He's reinscribing difference. And then he reinscribes it again with some of those works. And I think dress is also one of those areas where you find that. But I think I think also, of course, most of these works are being painted to be shown in exhibitions. And I think one of the areas, and I think to come back to your point, is there are works where Henry is depicted, for example, as a harlequin. And I think where we might find things more uncomfortable is, well, who is buying these pictures and what sort of interiors will they be displayed in? And in the case of the portrait of Henry Thomas as a harlequin, it was bought by Ciri Morn, who was Somerset Maugham's ex-wife, famous interior designer known for the white-on-white interiors, who had blackamoor figures in the same interior that she had the picture of Henry Thomas. So obviously, Philpott wasn't in control of where that picture ended up, but it's, again, how we might read that in terms of how those pictures were seen and understood by an audience in the 1930s as decorative objects can also be at times concerning, at times,
I have one thing to add. I think something that's maybe stifled me in addressing the question of transness in the Canadian context was also like the lack of precedent for doing that, and like using the dirty contemporary words, like, you know what I mean? So like, I think that stifled me as well into like diving and just like pulling the throttle back and just like going for it. But I appreciate that. I'm gonna work on that.
And I think you had.
So Simon, I just wanted to ask you about Philpott's fortunes as an artist. I mean, for somebody who hung out with Matisse and was considered, one of the greatest artists of his day, his star dimmed quite fast for a very, very long time. And one of the things that I've noticed in our exhibition is how powerfully people are responding to Philpott's work. And thus, I'm trying to figure out what happened and what you think is making it today all of a sudden relevant again.
I think in answer to your question about what happened, he died in November 1937. He was due to be representing Britain at the 1939 Venice Biennale, which of course didn't happen. Or was it 1940 Biennale he was due to be, which didn't happen. And I think a lot happened in terms of the taste for the sort of pictures he was creating. Britain in 1937 and Britain in 1947 were very different countries. You had a war of attrition and bombing and what have you. That kind of sensibility, that world was no longer there, and actually, of course, we had rationing in Britain until 1954, and so I think the kind of work he'd produced was seen by a lot of people as decadent and as belonging to a very different age. And I think actually, although interestingly, in the 1940s and 50s in Britain, you have this extraordinary age in terms of queer British artists. You have Francis Bacon, you have John Minton, you have Keith Vaughan, you have Robin Ironside, Edward Burrough, all kinds of figures, but they kind of work within the system. And one of the issues with Philpott was in the 1930s, lots of people saw him as being too bold, as not being restrained enough. And a key incident happened in 1935, and he, I should have said he was the youngest elected Royal Academician. When he was elected in 1923, he was the youngest, I think, for about a century. So he had this extraordinary kind of rise. But of course, he made the most glamorous pictures of pre-war aristocracy. But again, that also shifted after the Second World War. But in 1935, he did this picture called The Great Pan, which was very homoerotic depiction of Pan with an enormous flame in a strategic position. And he was forced to withdraw it from the Royal Academy. It was a sensation in all of the papers. And indeed, when he first exhibited those pictures in 1932 from Paris and Berlin, there were newspaper headlines that said, "Philpott goes Picasso." And what happened was all of his very, very loyal clients for whom he could command fees of several £1,000s a portrait, they didn't want to be associated with him. And so what happened during those last kind of 4 years of his life was suddenly he starts doing things like still life paintings, which he'd never needed to paint a still life, but he suddenly needed the money, and he was getting hundreds of pounds for pictures rather than thousands. So I think all of these things coming together, amount. And he had a memorial exhibition at the Tate Gallery in 1938, but of course again it was in that year of the Phony Year War. It's kind of phony war. So he kind of disappeared, and I think a lot of that was institutional self-policing and homophobia. And although lots of curators and museum directors, of course, were gay, they didn't want to stick their neck out. And I think that's why, and interestingly, when the exhibition of the National Portrait happened in 1984, it doesn't mention anywhere in the catalogue the fact that Philpott was a gay man, a queer man. And so there's lots and lots of euphemisms to describe things without ever really kind of saying what was blatantly obvious in all of the works. And I think, of course, only in the last few years that people have been more honest, and there is an interest in all that.
Are you sure?
I actually have one question. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to Philpott's identities as both gay and Catholic. A lot of people might see those as warring identities. I think a lot of us know that they're actually not. But yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that.
I think Philpott's parents were Baptists, and actually what's quite interesting is that when he converted to Catholicism, it's like a kind of coming out story in a way. When he converted to Catholicism, his parents threw him out because it was seen as such a below the pale kind of thing. But of course, actually, quite, rather like Oscar Wilde, so many of those figures around that time were very either high Anglican or Catholic. And so, I think in those early works, he did lots of paintings of things like receiving the Mass and things like this. There's a lot of kind of pomp and ceremony in all of those works. And I think there's really a kind of a strong connection. One of the things I think in all of Philpott's religious works, he tends to focus on a single male figure. Whilst there is, of course, a Black Madonna, it's clearly Henry Thomas as the Black Madonna. And it's a very, very muscular, rather male-looking Madonna. And so, again, which is utterly curious. It's but I think there's a very cinematic thing with his. I didn't show it in the talk, but there's a work. There's a couple of works. So one work was the Annunciation, and you see Gabriel approaching from the perspective of the Virgin Mary, and we could say that's a blasphemous position to take, but actually he's placing us, the viewer, in an extraordinary position. And I think one of the things he was often trying to do was to find a new way of approaching a subject from art history that no one else had done before. So there's often quite a lot of different things going on with those.
So, two things. Number one, a hefty round of applause for those beautiful talks. And it seems inappropriate for us to end things. Would you like to say something? I think that's a better mic.
Yeah, I think
I just want to say, first thing, thank you for staying with us all this time. But I just want to say that I hope that this is the first of many. The act that we are beginning today is something that will obviously occupy me for the rest of my life, occupy my students for the rest of theirs. This is a collective endeavor, and I think all we can do at this point is begin to open the door, but there's a long way to go. Thank you.